The microphone crackled once, and then Marcus Bellamy's voice filled the ballroom, warm and confident, the same voice that had once whispered promises to Elena Whitmore in the dark. Tonight, it was not whispering. Tonight, it was announcing, in front of 400 guests, that he was engaged to Vivian Ashford. Elena's glass of champagne stopped halfway to her lips. She did not put it down. She did not let her hand shake, though every nerve in her arms screamed at her to do exactly that. Around her, people began to clap. Somewhere, a woman gasped in delight. Somewhere else, a photographer's flash went off, freezing Marcus mid-smile, his arm around Vivian's waist, her diamond ring catching the light like a small cold star. 3 years. That was how long Elena had given him. 3 years of late nights at the office. 3 years of standing quietly behind him at press conferences. 3 years of believing that when the time came, he would choose her. She had told herself the timing was never right, that his company needed stability first, that love could wait a little longer, because the foundation had to be strong before the house could be built. She had believed every excuse because she had trusted the man giving them to her. Now she understood. The excuses had never been about timing, they had been about her. She set the champagne glass down on a passing waiter's tray with a steadiness that surprised even herself. Her heels made no sound on the marble floor as she turned, smiling at the people who caught her eye, nodding at a business partner who mouthed congratulations in her direction, assuming, as everyone in the room assumed, that she was simply another guest, not the woman who had shared Marcus's bed for 3 years and had quietly hoped for a different ending. She found the edge of the crowd and walked toward it without hurrying. Hurrying would have looked like running, and Elena Whitmore did not run. Behind her, Marcus was still speaking, his words rising over the applause, something about how Vivian understood him in a way no one else ever had. Elena did not turn to look at Vivian's face. She did not need to. She had already imagined it 1,000 times in the space of 30 seconds, the triumphant little curve of Vivian's lips, the practiced humility she would wear for the cameras, while her eyes searched the room for exactly one person to notice her win. Elena would not give her that satisfaction. She passed through the tall glass doors at the edge of the ballroom, out into the cool night air of the terrace, and only then did she allow herself to stop walking. The city stretched out below her, 1,000 tiny lights against the dark, indifferent to the fact that her whole future had just been rewritten in front of a room full of strangers. Her phone buzzed in her small clutch bag. She almost ignored it, but some old habit, some instinct built over years of managing Marcus's schedule and his moods and his image, made her check it anyway. It was a text from her assistant, Grace, who was not at the gala, but had clearly heard the news already through the company group chat. "Are you okay? Call me when you can." Elena typed back a single word. Fine. She was not fine, but she had spent 3 years learning how to look fine, and tonight, of all nights, she intended to use that skill. She heard the terrace door open behind her, and stiffened, half expecting Marcus, half dreading it. But it was not Marcus. It was Oliver Grant, an old friend from her university days who now worked in finance, and had been invited to the gala because his firm handled some of the company's investments. He took one look at her face, and did not bother with pleasantries. "You knew," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. "No," Elena said. "I did not know." Oliver swore under his breath, something sharp and short, and then seemed to catch himself, glancing around to make sure no one else had heard. "I am sorry, Elena. I truly am. I always thought—" He stopped himself. "Everyone thought," Elena said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired kind of clarity, the kind that comes after a long fever finally breaks. "I thought it too. That was the mistake." Oliver stood beside her for a while, not saying anything else, simply keeping her company, in the way old friends know how to do without being asked. Eventually he offered to walk her to her car, and she accepted, grateful for the distraction of small practical things, the parking ticket, the valet, the slow crawl of traffic away from the hotel, where her old life had just quietly ended. It was only when she was alone in her apartment, the door locked behind her, the city lights blinking beyond her window, that Elena allowed herself to sit down on the edge of her bed and finally feel the full weight of what had happened. She did not cry the way she had expected to. Instead, she felt something colder settle into her chest, something clear and hard, like glass. She thought of every dinner she had planned around his schedule, every business trip she had rearranged her own work to accompany, every time she had defended him to friends who wondered why, after 3 years, there was still no ring on her finger. She had told them he was careful, that he did not want to rush something so important. She had believed her own explanation completely. She opened her laptop, not because she wanted to work, but because she needed something to do with her hands, something to keep her mind from replaying the image of Vivian's ring, catching the light. Instead of opening a work file, she found herself scrolling through old photographs, dinners at quiet restaurants, a weekend trip to the coast 2 years ago, when Marcus had told her, in a low voice by the water, that she was the only woman who had ever truly understood the pressure he carried. She had believed that too. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was not Grace. It was an unknown number, a text with no name attached. I heard about tonight. I am sorry it happened this way. If you ever want to talk, my door is open. No pressure, no strings. Daniel Cross. Elena stared at the name for a long moment. Daniel Cross was not simply another name in her contact list. He was the man Marcus had spent the better part of a decade trying to outmaneuver in business, the founder of a rival technology firm that had, more than once, beaten Marcus's company to a deal by weeks or even days. Marcus rarely said Daniel's name without a note of contempt in his voice, always careful to frame him as reckless, as someone who cut corners to win. Elena had met Daniel only a handful of times, at industry dinners and conferences, where their companies happened to overlap. She remembered him as quiet in a room full of loud men, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke, and then, when he finally did speak, said something that made everyone else stop and reconsider their previous argument. She remembered, too, a strange moment at a conference the previous year, when Daniel had asked her a detailed question about a project she had led, one that had barely been mentioned in the press. Marcus had barely acknowledged that the project existed. Daniel had asked her 3 follow-up questions before Marcus steered the conversation elsewhere. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, sitting alone in her apartment at nearly midnight with her old life in pieces around her, she found herself reading his message twice, then a third time. No pressure, no strings. It should have felt strange, receiving kindness from her ex-partner's greatest rival, on the very night her ex-partner had humiliated her in public. Instead it felt, oddly, like the first honest thing anyone had said to her all evening. She did not reply immediately. She set the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back against her pillows, staring at the ceiling, letting the numbness spread through her limbs until sleep finally came, uneven and shallow, filled with fragments of Marcus's voice announcing a future that did not include her. She woke the next morning to sunlight cutting harsh lines across her bedroom floor, and, for one merciful moment, forgot everything that had happened. Then the memory returned all at once, a physical blow, and she lay still for a long time before forcing herself out of bed. Her phone had accumulated a small avalanche of messages overnight, colleagues offering vague, careful sympathy, clearly unsure how much they were allowed to say about a relationship that had never been officially confirmed by either party, despite everyone in their circle knowing exactly what it was. A cousin asking if the rumors were true. Grace, again, more insistent this time, asking Elena to call as soon as she was awake. And beneath all of it, still sitting there patiently, Daniel's message. Elena made coffee she did not really want and sat at her small kitchen table, turning her phone over in her hands. She thought about Marcus, about the calm, deliberate way he had built his image over the years. Always the visionary, always the man who made the difficult calls so others did not have to. She thought about how easily she had fit herself into the shape of whatever he needed her to be, how she had convinced herself that being essential was the same thing as being chosen. She thought about Vivian's ring, and the practiced humility on her face, and the years Elena had spent being told, gently, patiently, that the time was not yet right. By the time she finished her coffee, something in her had shifted, quietly but completely, the way a key turns in a lock with almost no sound at all. She was not going to spend the coming weeks hiding from a city that had watched her humiliation unfold in real time. She was not going to let Marcus's decision define the shape of the rest of her life. She picked up her phone and typed a reply to Daniel, deleting it twice before settling on something simple, something that did not reveal how much his message had meant, but did not pretend it had meant nothing either. "Thank you. I might take you up on that." She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, then set the phone down and looked around her small kitchen, at the life she had built quietly around the edges of someone else's ambitions. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder what her life might look like if it were built around her own. Later that afternoon, Grace arrived at her apartment uninvited, carrying a bag of pastries and a look of fierce, protective anger that made Elena laugh for the first time since the previous night, a short, surprised sound that felt strange in her throat. "I could kill him," Grace said, setting the bag down on the counter with more force than necessary. 3 years, Elena. 3 years, and he does it like that, in front of everyone, like you were nothing. "I was not nothing," Elena said quietly, and found, to her own surprise, that she believed it. "I was just not what he wanted, in the end. There is a difference." Grace studied her for a long moment, searching her face for cracks, for the tears she had clearly expected to find. When she did not find them, something like admiration flickered across her expression instead. "You are handling this better than I expected," Grace said. "I am handling it exactly as well as I need to," Elena replied, and reached for a pastry, biting into it with a steadiness that felt, for the first time in 12 hours, entirely her own. "The rest, I will figure out as I go." Outside her window, the city moved on, indifferent and enormous, carrying with it 1,000 other stories that had nothing to do with Marcus Bellamy or his shining new engagement. Elena watched it for a while, then turned back to Grace, and to the pastries, and to the slow, deliberate work of deciding who she wanted to become next. The office felt different on Monday morning, though nothing about it had physically changed. The same glass walls, the same hum of computers, the same view of the city skyline from the 40th floor. What had changed was the way people looked at Elena when she walked in, quick glances followed by quicker looks away, the particular silence of a room that has been talking about you moments before you entered it. She kept her chin level and her pace even, greeting the receptionist by name, stopping briefly at Grace's desk to drop off a folder as though it were any other Monday. It was not any other Monday, and everyone in the building knew it, but Elena had decided, somewhere between her second cup of coffee and the elevator ride up, that she would not give anyone the show they were hoping for. Marcus's office was on the same floor as her own, separated by only 2 conference rooms and a stretch of open desks. She had known, taking this job 3 years ago, that working so close to him carried its own risks, but she had never imagined this particular one, the risk of watching him build a life with someone else, from a distance of 30 feet. She made it until nearly noon without seeing him. Then, rounding a corner near the break room, she nearly walked directly into him, both of them stopping short, coffee cups raised like small shields between them. "Elena," his voice was careful, the voice he used in delicate negotiations, when he needed to seem reasonable, without conceding anything. "I wanted to talk to you, about the weekend." "There is nothing to talk about," she said, and was pleased to hear how calm the words sounded, how little of the previous 48 hours had leaked into her tone. "You made an announcement." "I understood it perfectly. It happened faster than I planned," Marcus said, lowering his voice as a junior employee passed them in the hallway, offering an awkward nod before hurrying on. Vivian's family wanted it public before the shareholder meeting. There were reasons, business reasons, that made the timing. "Marcus." Elena said his name simply, without heat, and it stopped him more effectively than any argument could have. "You do not owe me an explanation of your timing. You never did. That was rather the problem." For a moment, something flickered across his face, something that might have been guilt if she had allowed herself to believe he was still capable of feeling it toward her. Then it was gone, smoothed over by the same practiced composure he wore for board meetings and television interviews. "I still value what we built together," he said, "professionally. I hope that does not have to change." Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had once believed she understood completely, and found that she recognized almost nothing of him anymore. Not because he had changed, she realized, but because she was finally seeing him clearly for the first time in 3 years. "It will not change," she said, I intend to keep doing excellent work. Whether I do it here is a separate question. She left him standing in the hallway before he could respond, walking back to her office with her coffee cup steady in her hand, though her heart was pounding harder than she wanted to admit. That evening, she stayed late, not because there was urgent work to finish, but because going home to her empty apartment felt like surrendering to the silence that Marcus's absence had left behind. She was reviewing a report when her phone lit up with a message from Daniel Cross. I heard you handled the office today with more grace than anyone deserved from you. If you are still at work, there is a decent Italian place 2 blocks from your building. No agenda, just food, and better company than whatever is happening in that office right now. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something unfamiliar stir beneath the numbness she had been carrying for 2 days. Something almost like curiosity, almost like relief. She thought about how strange it was that the man Marcus considered his fiercest rival was the one person who had shown her simple, uncomplicated kindness since the gala. She typed back a reply before she could second-guess herself. Give me 20 minutes. The restaurant was small and quiet, the kind of place with dim lighting and no pretensions, the opposite of the glittering ballroom where her old life had ended 3 nights earlier. Daniel was already seated when she arrived, a glass of water in front of him rather than wine, and he stood when he saw her, a small formal gesture that felt oddly comforting. I wasn't sure you'd come, he admitted, once they were both seated. Neither was I, Elena said honestly, and found herself almost smiling. Their conversation began carefully, circling around safe topics, industry trends, a conference they had both attended the previous spring, the strange overlap of their professional worlds despite the rivalry between their companies. But slowly, as the evening wore on, the conversation deepened, and Elena found herself telling Daniel things she had not said out loud to anyone, not even Grace. He never once asked what I wanted, she said, turning her water glass slowly on the table. Not really. He asked what I thought about his projects, his decisions, his timeline. He never once asked what I wanted for myself. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression steady and attentive, the same expression she remembered from that conference the previous year, when he had asked her 3 thoughtful questions about a project Marcus had barely acknowledged. For what it is worth, Daniel said finally, I always thought your work on the logistics restructuring was the smartest thing to come out of his company in years. I remember being frustrated that our own team had not thought of it first. Elena blinked, surprised. You remember that project? I remember most things that impress me, Daniel said simply, without a trace of flattery in his voice, only quiet fact. It does not happen as often as people assume. Something in Elena's chest loosened slightly, a small unclenching she had not realized she was holding until it began to release. For 3 years, she had measured her worth by how useful she was to Marcus's vision, sitting across from a man who saw her work as valuable in its own right, independent of anyone else's ambitions, felt like stepping into air after being underwater for a very long time. They talked until the restaurant staff began stacking chairs around them, a polite hint that it was time to go. Daniel walked her to her car, and at the door, he did not linger too long or overstay the moment, a restraint that Elena noted and appreciated more than she expected to. I meant what I said in my text, he told her. No pressure, no strings. But if you are serious about wanting to build something for yourself, away from him, I would genuinely value having you on my team, not as a consolation, because you are good at what you do, and I have been trying to poach you from him for over a year, long before any of this happened. Elena stared at him, genuinely startled. You have been trying to poach me? Quietly, Daniel said, a small smile touching his mouth for the first time that evening. I did not want to complicate your position with him. I suppose that concern no longer applies. Driving home that night, Elena felt something she had not felt in longer than she could remember, a small flicker of possibility, a sense that the ground beneath her, though it had shifted violently 3 days earlier, might not be as unstable as she had feared. She thought about Daniel's steady attention, so different from Marcus's practiced charm, and wondered what it might mean to build a life measured by her own ambitions rather than someone else's need for her. The following week, she requested a meeting with the company's board, citing personal reasons for her resignation, careful to keep her language neutral and professional, giving no one the satisfaction of a public scandal. Marcus tried to speak with her privately before the meeting, his tone shifting between conciliatory and faintly desperate as he realized she was serious. "You do not have to do this," he said, standing in the doorway of her office as she packed the last of her belongings into a small box. "We can find a way to work together. This does not have to be so final." Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once been the entire architecture of her future, and felt, for the first time, something like peace settle over the ache that had been living in her chest since the gala. "It does have to be final," she said gently, not unkindly. "You built a future with someone else, Marcus. I am simply doing the same." She did not tell him about Daniel's offer. There would be time for that later, if it mattered at all. For now, it was enough to walk out of that office for the last time, box in her arms, chin level, knowing that whatever came next would be built on her own terms, brick by careful brick, with no one else's timeline to answer to. The building where Daniel Cross ran his company looked nothing like the polished marble towers where Elena had spent the last 3 years. It was older, a converted warehouse near the river with exposed brick walls and tall industrial windows that let in flood after flood of natural light. When Elena walked through the front doors on her first morning, she half expected the same hushed, guarded atmosphere she had grown used to at Marcus's company, the careful hierarchy, the sense that every conversation was being measured for its effect on someone's reputation. Instead, she found an open floor filled with people talking loudly over each other, whiteboards covered in half-finished diagrams, a dog sleeping under someone's desk in the corner. It felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a workshop, chaotic but alive, full of energy that had nowhere polished enough to hide. Daniel met her near the entrance, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, sleeves rolled up, no tie in sight. "Welcome to the mess," he said, gesturing at the open floor with something like pride. "I promise it makes sense eventually." "It looks like controlled chaos," Elena said, taking it all in. "Emphasis on controlled," Daniel replied, "most days." He led her to a corner office that was, to her surprise, actually meant for her, not shared, not borrowed, her name already printed on a small plaque beside the door. It was modest compared to the office she had left behind, but something about its simplicity felt right, a space she would fill with her own decisions rather than someone else's expectations. Her first weeks at the company passed in a blur of new names, new systems, new problems to solve. She had expected some adjustment period, some awkwardness in learning a new corporate culture, but what struck her most was how quickly her ideas were taken seriously. In her first project meeting, she proposed a restructuring of their supply chain communication, an idea similar in spirit to the project Daniel had once complimented from her time at Marcus's company. Rather than being politely acknowledged and then quietly shelved, as had so often happened before, her plan was discussed, debated, refined by input from 3 different departments, and ultimately approved within the week. "This is different," she told Grace over the phone one evening, still slightly stunned by how quickly things moved. "I say something, and people actually build on it instead of just nodding and moving to the next agenda item. That is what happens when people respect you as a colleague instead of an accessory," Grace said dryly, and Elena laughed, surprised by how true the observation felt. She saw Daniel often, though not as often as she might have expected, given how their working relationship had begun. He was careful, she noticed, about maintaining a professional distance during office hours, never singling her out for special attention in front of the rest of the team, never letting their easy rapport outside of work spill visibly into the workplace. It was a small thing, but it mattered to her, a sign that he understood exactly how fragile her position still felt, fresh as she was from the wreckage of one very public relationship. Outside the office, though, their friendship deepened steadily, quietly, in small moments that accumulated without either of them naming what was happening. A shared lunch that stretched into 2 hours. A late-night phone call after a difficult day, not about business, simply about nothing. About a book Elena was reading. About a hiking trail Daniel had discovered on the outskirts of the city. He never rushed her, never pushed the conversation toward anything she was not ready to discuss, and Elena found herself, for the first time in years, simply enjoying someone's company without calculating what she needed to say to keep him satisfied. One evening in late autumn, Daniel invited her to a small gathering at his apartment. Nothing formal, just a handful of colleagues gathering to celebrate a successful product launch. Elena arrived slightly nervous, unsure how to navigate a version of Daniel that existed outside the careful boundaries of the office. But any worry dissolved almost immediately in the easy warmth of the evening, laughter spilling from the kitchen, someone's terrible taste in music playing too loudly from a speaker in the corner. She found herself standing near the window with Daniel later in the evening, both of them slightly apart from the rest of the gathering, watching the lights of the city reflect off the river below. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, emboldened by the wine and the strange, comfortable ease of the evening. "Always," Daniel said. "Why did you really reach out to me that night, after the gala? You barely knew me." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he gave to every serious conversation. "I had watched you for a long time," he admitted finally, "long before that night. Watched the way you carried entire projects on your shoulders, while someone else took the credit in every press release. I always wondered what you might build, if you were finally given the room to try." "That is a very diplomatic way of saying you felt sorry for me," Elena said, though there was no sting in her words, only curiosity. "No," Daniel said, and his voice was firmer now, certain. "I never felt sorry for you. I was frustrated on your behalf, which is a different thing entirely. Pity assumes someone cannot help themselves. I never once believed that about you." Elena looked at him for a long moment, something warm unfolding slowly in her chest, unfamiliar after so long spent guarding against exactly this kind of vulnerability. "That is the first time anyone has separated those two things for me," she said quietly. "Pity and frustration. I did not know there was a difference until just now." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the party continuing behind them, neither feeling any urgency to rejoin it. It was Daniel who eventually broke the silence, his tone lighter now, careful to ease the moment back toward something less weighty. "I should also confess," he said, "that part of my motivation was entirely selfish. I wanted to beat Marcus at something that actually mattered to him, for once, rather than just another contract." Elena laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised her with how easily it came. So this was strategy after all. "A small percentage of it," Daniel admitted, smiling. "The rest was simply wanting to know you better. I am glad I finally have the chance." Weeks passed, and the line between colleague and something more began to blur so gradually that Elena could not identify the exact moment it happened. She noticed herself looking forward to their late-night phone calls with an anticipation that went beyond simple friendship. She noticed the careful way Daniel remembered small details she mentioned only once, the name of her favorite bookstore, the particular way she preferred her coffee, the anniversary of her grandmother's passing, which he acknowledged with a quiet, thoughtful gesture rather than any grand display. At the same time, word of her success at Daniel's company had begun filtering back through the industry grapevine, the way such things always do in a world as small and interconnected as theirs. Former colleagues reached out with careful, curious questions. A journalist covering a piece on industry talent movement requested a brief interview, which Elena declined, unwilling to let her story become entertainment for strangers. She knew, without needing confirmation, that word would eventually reach Marcus as well. She found, to her own surprise, that she no longer dreaded that possibility the way she once might have. Whatever he thought, whatever it stirred in him, was no longer her responsibility to manage. One afternoon, Grace called her with news that confirmed exactly what Elena had suspected. "He asked about you today," Grace said, her voice carrying a note of barely suppressed satisfaction. Casually, of course, pretending it was nothing, but he asked how you were doing at the new company, and whether it was true you had been promoted already. "What did you tell him?" Elena asked, curious despite herself. "I told him the truth," Grace said, "that you were doing better than you ever did here, and that everyone who mattered could see it plainly, whether he chose to or not." Elena smiled quietly to herself after ending the call, looking out over the city from her office window, the same skyline she had once watched from a very different building, under very different circumstances. She thought of Marcus's careful, practiced voice asking after her, and found that the question stirred almost nothing in her now, No ache, no satisfaction. Only a distant, mild curiosity about a man who was becoming, with each passing week, less and less central to the story of her own life. That evening, she met Daniel for dinner, and somewhere between the appetizer and the main course, she realized with quiet certainty that she was no longer building her new life in reaction to the one Marcus had taken from her. She was simply living it, on her own terms, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and it felt, more than anything else, like coming home to a version of herself she had almost forgotten existed. By winter, Elena had settled fully into the rhythm of her new life, though rhythm was perhaps too gentle a word for the pace at which things moved at Daniel's company. There was always another problem to solve, another deadline pressing close, another late night spent poring over reports with a cup of cooling coffee at her elbow. She found, unexpectedly, that she thrived in it, the constant motion, the sense that her ideas mattered enough to be argued about, rather than simply approved without discussion. She had been promoted twice since joining, first to lead a small cross-departmental team, then, only 2 months later, to oversee a much larger initiative that would determine the direction of the company's expansion into a new market. It was an enormous responsibility, the kind of role she had quietly hoped for during her years with Marcus, but had never been offered, always given instead the supporting work that made someone else's vision possible. Daniel called her into his office one afternoon in December, his expression unusually serious as she took the seat across from his desk. "I want to talk to you about the Western expansion," he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her. "The board wants someone to lead it from the ground up. New offices, new hires, an entirely new market to establish ourselves in. It is a massive undertaking." Elena opened the folder, scanning the details quickly, her mind already beginning to sketch out possibilities before she had even finished reading the first page. "You want me to lead this?" she said, not quite a question. "I want you to lead this," Daniel confirmed. "I have wanted it for weeks, honestly. But I needed to be certain the board would agree, and I needed to be certain you were ready, not just capable, which you obviously are, but ready to carry something this large entirely on your own." "And are you certain now?" Elena asked, looking up at him. "I have been certain since your second week here," Daniel said simply. "The board just needed time to catch up to what I already knew." Elena felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, though this time it was layered with something new, a fierce, quiet pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. She had spent 3 years being useful to Marcus's ambitions. This was something else entirely, an ambition of her own, offered to her not as a consolation, not as a reward for loyalty, but because someone genuinely believed she was capable of carrying it. "I accept," she said, and meant it completely. The months that followed tested her in ways she had not anticipated. Long stretches of travel scouting locations, difficult negotiations with local partners unfamiliar with her company, sleepless nights untangling logistical problems that seemed to multiply the moment one was resolved. Through it all, Daniel remained a steady presence, not hovering, not second-guessing her decisions, but always available when she genuinely needed his perspective, always trusting her judgment, even when the stakes were high enough to shake anyone's confidence. It was during one of these difficult stretches, a particularly grueling week of contract negotiations that had stretched late into 3 consecutive nights, that Elena found herself, exhausted and frustrated, venting to Daniel over a late dinner in a city far from home. "I keep waiting for the moment someone tells me I have overstepped," she admitted, pushing food around her plate without much appetite. "I keep waiting for the ceiling I was so used to under Marcus. It has not come. I do not entirely know what to do with that." Daniel set down his fork, studying her with the same quiet attentiveness she had come to rely on, more than she liked to admit. "There is no ceiling here, Elena," he said. "Not one I intend to build, at least. You built this expansion practically from nothing. The credit is entirely yours, and I will make certain everyone above us understands that clearly." "Why does that matter so much to you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "My credit, I mean. Most people in your position would simply take it for the company's success and move on." Daniel considered the question carefully before answering, the way he considered most things that mattered to him. Because I watched someone spend 3 years erasing your contributions before I ever met you properly, he said. I am not interested in becoming a second version of that mistake, no matter how small the difference might seem to anyone else. Elena was quiet for a long moment, moved more than she wanted to show. That is a rare thing, she said finally, her voice softer than she intended. Finding someone who notices the difference at all. Something shifted in the air between them then, a tension that had been building slowly for months, finally rising close enough to the surface that neither of them could fully ignore it. Daniel reached across the table, his hand resting near hers, not quite touching, waiting for her to close the remaining distance if she chose to. She did. Her fingers curled gently around his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the noise of the restaurant fading into a comfortable background hum around them. It was not a dramatic moment, no sudden confession, no sweeping declaration. It was simply two people who had spent months building something honest and steady, finally acknowledging what had been growing quietly between them all along. I was not looking for this, Elena said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. When I took this job, I was only looking for somewhere to survive. I did not expect to find something worth building toward instead. Neither was I looking for it, Daniel admitted, but I am glad I found it regardless. They did not rush what came next. There was no dramatic leap into a relationship, no sudden upheaval of the professional boundaries they had both worked hard to respect. Instead, things unfolded slowly, deliberately, in the same careful way Daniel approached everything of importance in his life. Dinners became more frequent, conversations grew more personal, and somewhere in the quiet accumulation of small moments, Elena realized she was falling in love with him, not in the sweeping, urgent way she had once fallen for Marcus, but in a steadier, more grounded way, the kind of love that did not ask her to shrink herself to make room for someone else's ambitions. Word of their closeness eventually made its way through the industry, as such things always do. Colleagues exchanged knowing glances during meetings when Daniel and Elena arrived within minutes of each other, for the third time in a week. A gossip column in a minor business publication ran a short, speculative piece, questioning whether the rising star of Daniel Cross's expansion project was more than simply an employee. Elena read it once, felt a brief flicker of old anxiety about public perception, and then set the article aside, unbothered by a truth that no longer felt like something to hide. She thought, occasionally, of Marcus, though less often than she once might have expected. She wondered sometimes if he had heard the rumors, if the thought of her happiness, built so publicly under the banner of his greatest professional rival, stirred anything in him at all. She found, when she examined the question honestly, that she no longer particularly cared what it stirred. His reaction was no longer a variable in the equation of her own contentment, and that realization, more than any romantic milestone with Daniel, felt like the truest measure of how far she had come. By the time the Western expansion officially launched, 6 months after Daniel had first handed her that folder across his desk, Elena stood at the center of a celebration that was entirely her own, surrounded by a team she had built, a project she had shaped from nothing into something thriving, and a man beside her who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was capable of being. It was, she thought, watching the lights of the new office glow warmly against the evening sky, exactly the kind of coronation she had always deserved. It had simply taken the collapse of one crown for her to find the one that had actually been meant for her all along. The industry gala had become an annual tradition, a night when every major company in the city gathered under one roof to celebrate the year's achievements, exchange careful pleasantries, and quietly size up the competition beneath layers of polished conversation. Elena had attended it every year for the past 4, first as Marcus's quiet companion standing slightly behind him in every photograph, and now, for the first time, as Daniel's colleague and something more, standing beside him rather than behind him, her name printed clearly on the program as the lead of the company's most successful expansion in a decade. She had chosen her dress carefully that year, not for Marcus's benefit, not to prove anything to anyone in that room, but simply because it made her feel like herself, sharp and certain, and entirely her own. Grace, who had insisted on helping her get ready, stepped back to admire the finished effect with obvious satisfaction. "You look like someone who has absolutely nothing left to prove," Grace said. "That is exactly the point," Elena replied, smiling at her reflection. The ballroom, when she arrived, felt smaller than she remembered, though she suspected the room itself had not changed at all. It was she who had changed, filling the space differently now, no longer shrinking herself to fit quietly into someone else's spotlight. Daniel met her near the entrance, offering his arm with an easy smile, and together they moved through the crowd, stopping to speak with colleagues and rivals alike. Elena's name mentioned respectfully in conversation after conversation, no longer an afterthought attached to someone else's success. She saw Marcus across the room before he saw her, standing near the bar with Vivian at his side, both of them dressed in the same careful, expensive elegance Elena remembered from countless events before. Vivian's hand rested on Marcus's arm in a gesture that seemed less affectionate than practiced, the way one might display an accessory rather than hold on to a partner. Elena noted the observation with mild curiosity rather than satisfaction, unsurprised to find that watching them together stirred almost nothing in her anymore. It was Marcus who noticed her first, his gaze catching on her from across the room and holding a beat longer than necessary before he composed himself and offered a polite, distant nod. Elena returned the gesture with equal composure and turned her attention back to Daniel, who had been watching the brief exchange with quiet interest. "That did not seem to bother you at all," Daniel observed. "It did not," Elena confirmed, and realized, saying it aloud, how completely true the statement was. The evening continued smoothly for nearly 2 hours, filled with the usual rhythm of industry events, brief conversations, careful networking, the occasional toast to someone's recent success. It was during a lull near the edge of the room, while Daniel had stepped away briefly to speak with a business partner, that Marcus approached her directly, his expression carefully neutral in the way she recognized from years of watching him manage difficult conversations. "You look well," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it over the ambient noise of the room. "I am well," Elena replied simply, offering nothing more. "I heard about the expansion," Marcus continued, seeming determined to keep the conversation going, despite her clear lack of encouragement. "It is impressive work. I always knew you were capable of something like that." Elena studied him for a moment, searching for the sting she had expected his words to carry, and finding, to her genuine surprise, that they landed with no weight at all. "You knew," she repeated, letting the words sit between them for a moment. "And yet you never once gave me the chance to prove it under your own company's banner." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, the closest thing to discomfort she had seen cross his face all evening. "That is not entirely fair," he said. "You had opportunities with me." "I had responsibilities with you," Elena corrected gently, without anger, simply stating a fact she had come to understand clearly over the past year. "There is a difference, Marcus, and I did not fully see it myself until I found somewhere that offered me the other thing instead." He was quiet for a moment, and Elena watched something shift behind his carefully composed expression, a flicker of genuine uncertainty that she had rarely seen from him even during their years together. "Are you happy?" he asked finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of some of its usual polish. "Yes," Elena said, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land harder than any elaborate explanation could have. "I am happier than I think I ever fully allowed myself to be with you, though I did not understand that until it was far too late to matter." Marcus opened his mouth as though to respond, but before he could, Vivian appeared at his side, her smile bright and practiced, her eyes flicking briefly, assessingly, toward Elena, before settling back on Marcus with a possessive kind of warmth. "Darling, they are waiting for us for photographs," Vivian said, her tone light, but carrying an unmistakable undertone, a clear signal that the conversation was over, whether Marcus wished it to be or not. Marcus glanced once more at Elena, something unreadable passing across his face, and then allowed himself to be led away, back into the glittering crowd, back into the life he had chosen over the one that might have included her. Daniel returned a few minutes later, glancing at her with quiet concern. "Everything all right?" "Everything is fine," Elena said, and found, examining the statement honestly, that it was entirely true. "He asked if I was happy." "And what did you tell him?" "The truth," Elena said, looking up at Daniel with a small, genuine smile. "That I am happier now than I ever managed to be with him, and that it took losing everything I thought I wanted to finally understand what I actually needed instead. Daniel's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers without hesitation, without checking first who might be watching. "I am glad you found it," he said simply. "Whatever it took to get here." They stayed until the end of the evening, long after Marcus and Vivian had departed for their photographs and their carefully curated appearances elsewhere in the room. Elena found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely present in the moment she was living, unburdened by comparisons to a past that no longer held any real claim over her. Driving home that night, the city lights streaming past the car windows, she thought about the version of herself who had stood on that terrace a year earlier, glass of champagne forgotten in her hand, watching her entire future collapse in a single announcement. She thought about how impossible it would have seemed, in that moment, to imagine feeling grateful for what had happened, and yet here she was, exactly that, grateful, not for the pain itself, but for everything it had cleared away to make room for something far more honest to grow. Beside her, Daniel drove in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing over with a small smile that needed no explanation. Elena reached across the console and took his hand again, resting their joined fingers lightly against her knee, and watched the city blur past outside her window, no longer looking backward at all, only forward, toward whatever came next. Marcus Bellamy had built his career on the ability to control every variable in a room, to walk into a negotiation already knowing 3 steps ahead how the other side would respond, to shape outcomes before they had even begun to unfold. It was a skill that had made him wealthy, respected, and, in certain circles, quietly feared. It was also a skill that had utterly failed him in the months since the industry gala, where Elena had told him, with such calm certainty, that she was happier than she had ever been with him. He told himself, at first, that the unsettled feeling was simple professional jealousy. Daniel Cross's company had posted record numbers that quarter, largely attributed to the Western expansion that Elena had led from the ground up. It was natural, Marcus reasoned, to feel some competitive irritation watching a rival succeed so visibly, especially with a project built on the very kind of talent his own company had once possessed, and, through his own carelessness, had let walk out the door. But the feeling did not stay confined to the boardroom the way professional jealousy usually did. It followed him home. It sat with him at dinner, when Vivian spoke at length about wedding preparations, venue options, guest lists that needed trimming, and Marcus found his attention drifting, his responses growing shorter and more distracted with each passing week. "You are not listening to me," Vivian said one evening, setting down her fork with a sharpness that cut through his thoughts. "I am listening," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow even to him. "You have not been listening for weeks," Vivian pressed, her voice tightening with an frustration that had clearly been building for longer than this single conversation suggested. "Ever since that gala, ever since you spoke with her." Marcus set down his own fork, choosing his words carefully, the way he chose words in every difficult negotiation. "It was a brief conversation, Vivian, nothing more." "I saw your face when she walked away," Vivian said, and there was something raw beneath her usual polish now, something that made Marcus realize, uncomfortably, that she had been watching him far more closely than he had noticed. "I know that look, Marcus. I have seen it in the mirror often enough, watching you look at other things you wanted and could not quite reach." The comparison stung more than Marcus expected, and he found himself, for once, without a smooth response ready. "That is not fair," he said finally, though the protest felt weaker than he wanted it to. "Is it not?" Vivian asked, her voice quiet now, almost tired. "Tell me honestly, Marcus. Do you still think about her?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything either of them had said aloud in months. Marcus thought of a dozen careful, diplomatic answers, the kind of language he used to smooth over difficult moments in board meetings, to reassure nervous investors, to manage every relationship in his life with the same practiced control. None of them came. "I do not know how to answer that honestly without hurting you," he admitted finally, and the honesty surprised even himself. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable in a way that made Marcus distinctly uncomfortable. A woman who had built her own reputation, on always appearing composed, now visibly struggling to maintain that composure. "That is an answer in itself," she said eventually, and rose from the table without another word, leaving Marcus alone with his unfinished dinner and the uncomfortable weight of a truth he had been avoiding for months. He did not sleep well that night, or for several nights after. He found himself, in idle moments during the workday, searching for news of Elena's expansion project, reading industry articles that praised her leadership in terms that felt, uncomfortably, like they should have belonged to descriptions of his own company's success, under his own guidance, years earlier, when she had been the quiet engine behind so much of what he had built. He thought back over their 3 years together, replaying conversations he had barely registered at the time, moments when she had suggested ideas he had quietly absorbed and presented as his own in meetings, moments when she had managed crises behind the scenes so seamlessly that no one, including himself, had fully understood how much of the company's stability rested on her shoulders rather than his. He thought, too, of the night of the gala, of the calm, steady way she had walked away from the ballroom rather than causing the scene he had half-braced himself for. He had told himself, in the immediate aftermath, that her composure meant she had not truly loved him, that a woman who loved him would have fought harder for what she believed she deserved. It was a convenient story, he realized now, one that had allowed him to avoid examining his own choices too closely. The truth, he understood now, with a clarity that felt uncomfortably late in arriving, was that Elena had never needed to fight for anything, because she had simply been too dignified to beg for a place that should have been offered to her freely, without hesitation, years before Vivian's family connections had ever entered the equation. He found himself, one evening, sitting alone in his office, long after the rest of the building had emptied, staring at an old photograph still saved on his phone, taken 2 years earlier during that weekend trip to the coast. Elena, laughing at something just out of frame, sunlight catching the edges of her hair. He had told her that night, by the water, that she was the only person who truly understood the pressure he carried. He remembered meaning it completely at the time. He wondered, now, what exactly he had meant by it, if understanding his pressure had simply been another quiet job he had assigned her, without ever asking whether she wanted the role. His phone buzzed with a message from Vivian, brief and businesslike, informing him she would be staying at her sister's apartment for a few days to think. Marcus read the message twice, feeling a distant, muted concern that seemed proportionate to the situation, but somehow smaller than it should have been, dwarfed entirely by the larger unrest that had been building in him for weeks. He set the phone down and sat in the quiet of his empty office, surrounded by the trappings of everything he had built, the awards on the wall, the framed magazine covers celebrating his vision, and found, for the first time in his career, that none of it felt like enough to fill the particular emptiness that had settled into his chest since the moment Elena told him, with such calm certainty, that she had finally found somewhere she was genuinely happy. He did not reach out to her. He told himself it would be inappropriate, unfair to Vivian, regardless of the state of their relationship, unfair to Elena, who had rebuilt her life with such deliberate care that she deserved better than his belated regret intruding upon it. But the restraint cost him more than he expected, and in the weeks that followed, colleagues began to notice a distraction in him that had never existed before, a hesitation in decisions that had once been made with swift, unwavering confidence. At a board meeting in early spring, discussing the company's disappointing quarterly performance in a market segment that Elena had once quietly managed before her departure, one of the senior directors finally said aloud what several others had clearly been thinking for months. "We have not replaced her properly," the director said, not unkindly, simply stating an observation that had become impossible to ignore. Not her role, her judgment. We built too much of this company around decisions she was making quietly, and none of us noticed until she was gone. Marcus sat with the comment for a long moment, feeling its weight settle over him in front of the entire board, a public acknowledgement of a private truth he had been avoiding since the night of the gala. He had chosen Vivian for reasons that had, at the time, felt entirely sound: family connections, social standing, the kind of partnership that photographed well and satisfied a set of expectations he had never fully examined. He had chosen her, in the end, for everything except the reason that should have mattered most. He had never once, in 3 years, chosen Elena the way she deserved to be chosen. And now, watching Daniel Cross's company thrive under the weight of her talent, while his own struggled to fill the silence she had left behind, Marcus understood, with the particular clarity that arrives far too late to change anything, exactly what that failure of choice had cost him. Vivian Ashford had grown up understanding, in the particular way certain families teach their daughters, that appearances mattered as much as substance, that a well-managed image could carry a person through almost any difficulty life presented. She had applied that lesson carefully throughout her engagement to Marcus, smiling through public appearances, managing wedding planning with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every other project in her life, telling herself that the small distances growing between them were simply the ordinary strain of two busy people, preparing for a demanding future together. She had noticed the change in him gradually, then all at once, the way certain truths often arrive. It had started with small things, a distracted quality in his voice during dinner, a habit of checking his phone more frequently than usual, though never in a way that suggested anything as obvious as a message from someone specific. It was subtler than that, a kind of internal withdrawal, as though some part of him had quietly stepped back from the life they were building together, leaving only a polite, dutiful version of himself behind. The gala had been the turning point, though it had taken Vivian several weeks to fully understand what she had witnessed that evening. She had seen the brief exchange between Marcus and Elena from across the room, had noted the particular stillness in Marcus's posture, the way his eyes followed Elena's departure, a beat longer than casual acquaintance would explain. She had told herself, at the time, that it was nothing, old history stirred briefly by proximity, the kind of thing that would fade naturally once the evening ended. It had not faded. If anything, it had grown, a quiet undertow pulling Marcus further from her with each passing week, and Vivian, who had never been a woman inclined toward denial once evidence became undeniable, finally allowed herself to name what she had been avoiding for months. Staying at her sister's apartment gave her the distance she needed to think clearly, away from the careful performances they had both grown accustomed to maintaining in front of each other. Her sister, Margaret, older and considerably more direct, did not bother softening her observations. "You have known something was wrong for months," Margaret said one evening, handing Vivian a cup of tea she had not asked for but was grateful to receive anyway. "I watched you at your own engagement dinner, Vivian. You were performing happiness. That is not the same as feeling it." "It is complicated," Vivian said, though even as she said it, she recognized the excuse for the thin shield it truly was. "It is not complicated," Margaret replied gently. "You fell in love with a man who was still in love with someone else. That is a very old story, and it rarely ends the way anyone hopes it will." Vivian sat with that observation for a long time after Margaret left the room, turning it over carefully, examining it from every angle the way she examined every difficult problem in her life. She thought back over the early months of her relationship with Marcus, the whirlwind courtship that had felt, at the time, like being swept into something inevitable and grand. She had known, even then, in some quiet corner of her awareness, that Elena existed in the background of Marcus's history, a name occasionally mentioned by colleagues with a particular carefulness that suggested more history than anyone was willing to explain outright. She had chosen, deliberately, not to ask too many questions, telling herself that whatever had existed before her did not matter once Marcus had chosen to move forward with someone else. She understood now, with painful clarity, how naive that choice had been. She returned to the apartment she shared with Marcus a week later, not because she had resolved anything, but because avoiding the conversation any longer felt like its own kind of cowardice, a luxury she was no longer willing to afford herself. She found him in his study, surrounded by reports he was not actually reading, staring at nothing in particular, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something unguarded and uncertain that made him look, briefly, far younger than his years. "We need to talk honestly," Vivian said, closing the door behind her. "Not the version of honest we have been managing for the past 6 months. Actually honest." Marcus looked up, and something in his expression suggested relief, as though he had been waiting for someone else to force the conversation. He had not found the courage to begin himself. "All right," he said quietly. "Do you love me?" Vivian asked, and made herself hold his gaze steadily as she waited for the answer. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Vivian watched him search, genuinely search, for an answer that would not be a comfortable lie. "I care about you deeply," he said finally, choosing his words with obvious effort. "I respect you. I have enjoyed building a life alongside you these past months, more than I expected to, honestly." "That is not what I asked," Vivian said, though her voice carried more sadness than anger now. "I know," Marcus admitted, and the honesty of the admission seemed to cost him something significant. "I do not think I can give you the answer you deserve, Vivian. I think I have known that for longer than I have been willing to say aloud, and I am sorry for how long it has taken me to find the honesty to admit it clearly." Vivian felt the confirmation land, with a strange mixture of pain and relief, the particular sensation of finally hearing spoken aloud a truth she had already known in her body for weeks. "It is Elena," she said. Not quite a question. Marcus did not deny it. "It was never resolved," he said quietly. "I think I convinced myself that choosing you would settle something in me that her presence had unsettled for years. I was wrong to use you that way, Vivian, even if I did not fully understand I was doing it at the time." The words hurt, sharper than Vivian expected, but they also carried an odd clarity that felt, in its own painful way, like a gift. She had spent months managing the slow erosion of a relationship without understanding its cause, blaming herself in quiet moments for whatever she might be doing wrong, whatever effort she might be failing to make. Understanding now that the problem had never truly been about her at all, that it predated her involvement entirely, felt strangely freeing, even amid the grief of watching her engagement dissolve in real time. "I think we both know what needs to happen now," Vivian said finally, removing her engagement ring with a steadiness that surprised her, setting it carefully on the desk between them, rather than throwing it, rather than making the moment more dramatic than it needed to be. Marcus looked at the ring for a long moment, then back up at her, something like genuine sorrow crossing his face. "I am sorry, Vivian. I wanted this to work. I think some part of me genuinely believed it could, if I simply committed hard enough to making it so." "Commitment built on the wrong foundation does not hold, Marcus," Vivian said, echoing, without realizing it, almost exactly the sentiment Elena had once expressed to Grace in the early days after the gala. "I hope you find whatever it is you have been avoiding for so long. I truly do. But it cannot be with me, not anymore." She left the apartment that evening with a single suitcase, the same steady composure that had carried her through countless public appearances, now carrying her through the ending of the relationship that had defined the past year of her life. She did not know, walking out the door, exactly what would come next for her, but she understood, with a clarity that felt hard-won, that whatever it was, would be built on something more honest than the foundation she had just walked away from. Behind her, Marcus sat alone in his study, the ring still resting on the desk where Vivian had left it, and allowed himself, finally, to fully confront the truth he had spent nearly a year avoiding. He had lost Elena not because circumstances had taken her from him, but because he had made a series of quiet, cowardly choices that had pushed her steadily away, choice after choice, until there had been nothing left for her to do but walk out that ballroom door and build a life entirely without him. And now, sitting alone in the wreckage of his second failed attempt at happiness, Marcus understood, far too late to change anything meaningful, exactly how much that failure had cost him. News of the broken engagement moved through the industry with the particular speed reserved for stories that combined money, romance, and public spectacle in equal measure. Elena heard about it first from Grace, who called her on a Tuesday evening with a voice carefully controlled to avoid sounding too pleased about delivering the news. "Vivian ended it," Grace said, skipping any preamble. "Apparently she moved out weeks ago. It is only becoming public now because someone from his office finally leaked it to a business gossip page." Elena sat with the news for a moment, examining her own reaction carefully, the way she had learned to examine most things since the night of the gala. She waited for satisfaction, or vindication, or some sharp flare of old feeling finally released after months of careful containment. None of it came. What she felt instead was something quieter, more distant, a mild curiosity about a man whose story had once dominated her entire emotional landscape and now occupied only a small, unremarkable corner of it. "How do you feel about that?" Grace asked, clearly expecting a stronger reaction than Elena's calm silence suggested. Honestly, Elena said slowly, working through the answer as she spoke it aloud. I feel very little about it at all. I think that surprises me more than the news itself does. She told Daniel about it later that evening, over a quiet dinner at his apartment, the easy domestic comfort of their relationship now so thoroughly established that neither of them needed elaborate gestures to feel connected. Daniel listened without much visible reaction, setting down his fork thoughtfully once she finished. Does it change anything for you? He asked, his tone careful, giving her space to answer honestly, without steering her toward any particular response. No, Elena said, and found, saying it aloud, that the answer was entirely true. It does not change anything. I think that is the clearest sign of how far I have come. A year ago, this news would have consumed me for weeks. Tonight, it barely registers beyond a passing conversation over dinner. Daniel smiled, something warm and quietly proud in his expression. That is a good place to be, he said. It is, Elena agreed, and I owe a considerable part of that to you, though I suspect you already know that. The industry continued its usual churn of speculation and gossip in the weeks that followed, colleagues quietly wondering whether Marcus might attempt to reach out to Elena now that his engagement had dissolved, whether old history might reassert itself given a second opportunity. Elena heard the whispers secondhand through Grace, and occasionally through colleagues who seemed to expect some dramatic reunion narrative, the kind of story that made for satisfying gossip regardless of its actual likelihood. Marcus did reach out, eventually, though not in the way anyone might have expected. He did not call her directly, did not send the kind of message that might have felt like an attempt to reopen old wounds for his own convenience. Instead, he sent a formal, carefully worded letter to her office, an apology, brief and specific, acknowledging the ways he had failed to value her contributions during their years together, taking responsibility without asking anything of her in return. Elena read the letter twice, sitting alone in her office one quiet afternoon, feeling a complicated mixture of things she had not expected, a distant echo of old pain, but also something like closure, a sense that a chapter she had already moved past was finally, formally, being acknowledged by the person who had written its most difficult pages. She did not respond to the letter immediately. She sat with it for several days, considering what, if anything, she wanted to say, and eventually decided that a brief, gracious acknowledgement was the most honest response she could offer, neither reopening old wounds, nor pretending the letter had not moved her in some small way. Thank you for your honesty, she wrote back, keeping the message short and measured. I hope you find whatever it is you are still searching for. I have found what I needed, and I am grateful for it, difficult as the path to get here sometimes was. She sent the message and closed her laptop, feeling a quiet, settled peace that she recognized, with some surprise, as genuine forgiveness, not the kind that erased what had happened, but the kind that simply released its grip on her present life, allowing her to move forward unburdened by resentment she no longer needed to carry. That weekend, Daniel took her to the coast, a quiet, deliberate choice on his part, she suspected, though he had said nothing explicit about the significance of the location. They walked along the shoreline in the late afternoon light, the same kind of golden hour that had once framed a very different conversation, years earlier, with a very different man. This feels different, Elena said, watching the waves roll steadily against the sand. Good different, or difficult different? Daniel asked, glancing at her with quiet attentiveness. Good different, Elena confirmed, smiling. I think I needed to come back to a place like this, with someone who actually means what he says when we are standing in it. Daniel took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers as they continued walking. I have been thinking about something, he said, his tone carrying a slight nervousness that was unusual for him, a man normally so steady in every conversation. Not tonight, not this exact moment, but soon. I want you to know that whatever happens next between us, I am not interested in half measures. I have watched you build an entire life out of the wreckage someone else left behind, and I would consider it the honor of my life to build the next chapter of that life alongside you, properly, completely. Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something warm and certain settling into her chest. Are you telling me something? Or asking me something? she said, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Neither, yet, Daniel said, laughing softly. Simply letting you know it is coming, whenever the moment feels right. I did not want it to catch you by surprise when it finally does. I appreciate the warning, Elena said, still smiling, and leaned into him as they continued their walk along the shore, the sun sinking slowly toward the water, casting long golden light across the sand. She thought, walking beside him, of how far she had traveled since that terrible night at the gala, from a woman who had believed her worth was measured entirely by how essential she made herself to someone else's ambitions, to a woman standing here now, secure in her own accomplishments, loved by someone who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was capable of being. The letter from Marcus sat, unanswered beyond her brief reply, somewhere in the folder of her past, a closed chapter she no longer needed to revisit. What lay ahead of her now, walking along this same shoreline with a man who had chosen her deliberately, fully, without hesitation, felt like an entirely different story altogether, one she was finally, fully, the author of herself. Spring arrived early that year, the city shaking off winter faster than usual, trees along the river blooming weeks ahead of schedule, as though eager to match the sense of new beginning that had settled quietly over Elena's life. She barely noticed the season changing around her, absorbed instead in the final preparations for the second phase of the Western expansion, a project that had grown, under her leadership, into one of the company's most celebrated successes in years. Daniel had been unusually attentive in recent weeks, a fact Elena noticed, but did not question too closely, assuming it was simply the natural rhythm of a demanding season for both of them, filled with client dinners and quiet evenings spent reviewing reports together at his apartment. She did not suspect, walking into what she believed was an ordinary Friday evening dinner, that anything unusual was about to unfold. Daniel had reserved a small private room at the same restaurant where they had first admitted, quietly, over a table full of unfinished food, that something real was growing between them. Elena noticed the significance of the location the moment she walked in, a small smile tugging at her lips as she took her seat across from him. "You are sentimental," she said, teasing him gently. "I did not expect that from you." "I am selectively sentimental," Daniel corrected, though his usual composure seemed slightly less steady than normal, a fact Elena filed away with quiet curiosity as their dinner progressed. They talked easily through the meal, covering the usual comfortable ground of two people deeply familiar with each other's days, the small triumphs and frustrations of their respective projects, an amusing story about a client meeting that had gone slightly sideways earlier that week. It was only near the end of the meal, as the staff cleared their plates and left them alone in the quiet privacy of the small room, that Daniel's demeanor shifted noticeably. "I told you, months ago, on that beach, that I was not interested in half measures," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible nervousness beneath it. "I have been thinking about that conversation every day since." Elena felt her pulse quicken, understanding, with sudden clarity, exactly where the evening was heading. "Daniel," she said softly. "Let me finish," he said, a small, nervous laugh escaping him. "I have rehearsed this more times than I am willing to admit." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small box, setting it on the table between them, but not yet opening it, his eyes steady on hers. "I have spent my whole career being careful about risk," he said, calculating odds, weighing costs against benefits, making sure every major decision was sound before I committed to it. You are the only genuinely reckless decision I have ever made, Elena, and the only one I have never once questioned since I made it. He opened the box, revealing a ring far simpler than the one Elena remembered from that terrible night at the gala, understated and elegant in a way that felt, unmistakably, like it had been chosen with her specifically in mind, rather than any external expectation of grandeur. "I do not want to simply be an improvement on what came before," Daniel continued, his voice steadying now, growing more certain with each word. "I want to be the choice you make because it is right, not because it is better than the alternative. I love you, Elena, not despite everything that happened before us, but because of the strength you carried through it, and I would consider it the greatest privilege of my life if you would marry me." Elena felt tears gather, unexpected and warm, the first real tears she had shed since the night of the gala, though these carried none of the grief of that earlier moment, only overwhelming, uncomplicated joy. "Yes," she said, the word arriving without hesitation, without the careful deliberation she had once applied to every major decision in her life. "Yes, absolutely yes." Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that were, she noticed with quiet affection, trembling slightly, despite his careful composure throughout the evening. She looked down at it, simple and beautiful, catching the light in a way that felt entirely different from the way Vivian's ring had once caught the light across a crowded ballroom, this one carrying no weight of comparison, no shadow of anyone else's choices, only the clean, certain promise of a future she had built entirely on her own terms. "I have one more thing to tell you," Daniel said, once the initial rush of emotion had settled slightly, both of them still smiling at each other across the table, with the particular giddiness of a moment neither wanted to rush past too quickly. "I want to announce this properly, publicly, at the industry gala next month. Not to prove anything to anyone, simply because I want the world to see exactly how proud I am to have you as my partner, in every sense of the word." Elena felt a small flicker of something complicated at the mention of the gala, memories of that terrible night stirring briefly before settling, gently, into something entirely different, a sense of reclamation rather than dread. "The same venue?" she asked. "The same venue," Daniel confirmed, watching her carefully to gauge her reaction. "If it feels wrong, we can choose somewhere else. I only suggested it because I thought there might be something meaningful in choosing it deliberately this time, rather than letting it remain a place defined by someone else's decision." Elena considered the idea for a long moment, turning it over carefully, and found, examining her own feelings honestly, that the suggestion did not frighten her at all. If anything, it felt like exactly the right kind of ending to write. A deliberate, conscious choice to return to the place where her old life had ended, this time standing at the center of the room, rather than fleeing quietly toward its edges. "I would like that," she said finally, smiling. "I think it is exactly the right place to begin this properly." News of their engagement spread through the industry, with the same speed that had once carried news of Marcus's engagement to Vivian, though the story this time carried a different weight entirely, less scandal, more quiet admiration, for two people who had built something genuine out of circumstances that could easily have turned bitter and small instead. Grace called within hours of the news breaking, her voice bright with genuine happiness. "I always liked him," Grace said, "from the very beginning, even when you were still too cautious to admit what was happening between you." "I was protecting myself," Elena said, laughing softly. "I think that was fair, given the circumstances." "It was more than fair," Grace agreed. "And look where that caution led you. Exactly where you were always meant to be." Elena looked down at the ring on her finger again that evening, alone in her apartment after Daniel had walked her home, replaying the whole evening with a warmth that had not fully faded. She thought of the woman she had been a year earlier, standing on that terrace with her champagne glass forgotten in her hand, believing her entire future had just been shattered beyond repair. She thought of how impossible it would have seemed, in that moment, to imagine feeling this settled, this certain, this completely at peace with everything that had happened in between. The gala, when it finally arrived, would offer her the chance to close that particular circle deliberately, on her own terms, surrounded by a life she had built entirely for herself. For now, though, she simply allowed herself to sit with the quiet joy of the evening, the ring catching soft light on her finger, a promise of a future finally, fully, chosen with intention, rather than settled for, out of quiet desperation. The ballroom looked almost exactly as Elena remembered it, the same soaring ceilings, the same warm golden lighting, the same view of the city glittering beyond the tall glass doors leading to the terrace, where she had once stood alone, steadying herself against the collapse of everything she had believed her future would be. This time, though, she stood at the center of the room, rather than its edges, and the difference in that simple fact felt, to her, like the truest measure of everything that had changed in the past year. She had chosen her dress with the same deliberate care she remembered from a year earlier, though this time the intention behind it felt entirely different. Not armor against humiliation, but a genuine celebration of a life she had built with clear eyes and steady hands. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, both of them greeting guests as they arrived, the easy warmth between them, obvious to anyone who took even a moment to notice. Grace arrived early, embracing Elena tightly before stepping back to admire the ring on her finger for what was easily the 10th time since the engagement had been announced. "I still cannot believe how far you have come in a single year," Grace said, shaking her head with obvious affection. "This room owes you an entirely different memory now." "It does," Elena agreed, smiling as she looked around the familiar space, feeling none of the old anxiety that had once threatened to overwhelm her here. "I think that is exactly why we chose it." The evening unfolded much like the industry gala the previous year, familiar faces circulating through the crowd, careful conversations exchanged between colleagues and rivals alike, the same orchestra playing softly in the corner. But the atmosphere around Elena felt entirely different this time, warmer, more genuine, free of the quiet undercurrent of pity that had followed her through the room a year earlier. She saw Marcus arrive partway through the evening, alone, his presence quieter and less commanding than she remembered from years past. Word had reached her, through the usual channels, that he had spent the months since his broken engagement focused almost entirely on rebuilding his company's culture, attempting, in his own quiet way, to correct some of the patterns that had allowed so much of Elena's contribution to go unacknowledged during her years there. She did not know how much of that effort was genuine reflection, and how much was simple damage control, but she found, watching him move carefully through the crowd, that she no longer needed to know the answer. His growth, or lack of it, was no longer any part of her responsibility to measure. He approached her near the edge of the dance floor later in the evening, waiting for a natural pause in her conversation with a group of colleagues, before stepping forward. "Congratulations," he said simply, his eyes flicking briefly to the ring on her finger, before returning to her face. "I mean that sincerely." "Thank you, Marcus," Elena said, and found that she meant her response just as sincerely, free of any lingering bitterness that might once have colored the exchange. "I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I already wrote," Marcus continued, his voice quieter now, stripped of the polished confidence she remembered from their years together. "I do not expect it to change anything between us. I simply wanted you to hear it directly, in person, rather than only on paper." Elena studied him for a moment, considering her response carefully. "I appreciate that," she said finally. "I think I have made my peace with everything that happened, Marcus. Genuinely. I do not carry anger toward you anymore, but I also do not think we need to revisit it further tonight. This evening is not about the past." Marcus nodded, accepting the boundary without argument, a small, rueful smile crossing his face. "You are right," he said. "You look happy, Elena. Genuinely happy, in a way I do not think I ever managed to give you. I am glad you found it, even if I regret, deeply, that it was not with me." "I am glad too," Elena said simply, and there was no cruelty in the honesty of the statement, only a clear, settled truth. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." He nodded once more, and stepped back into the crowd, leaving Elena standing quietly at the edge of the dance floor, watching him disappear among the other guests. She felt, watching him go, a final, gentle release of whatever small thread had still connected her to that old chapter of her life, a closing not of anger, but of completion, the last page of a story that no longer needed her active attention to finish properly on its own. Daniel found her a few moments later, having watched the exchange from a respectful distance, his expression carrying quiet concern. "Are you all right?" "I am more than all right," Elena said, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "I think I just closed a door I did not fully realize was still slightly open. It feels good, actually. Lighter." Daniel smiled, pulling her gently toward the center of the dance floor, as the orchestra shifted into a slower song. "Then let us celebrate the doors that are open instead," he said, drawing her close. They danced together in the middle of the room, surrounded by the same glittering crowd that had once witnessed Elena's quiet devastation in this exact space, though tonight the room held an entirely different story, one written deliberately, chosen carefully, built from the ground up on foundations far sturdier than anything she had known before. She rested her head against Daniel's shoulder as they moved slowly to the music, watching the lights of the city glow softly through the tall glass doors beyond the dance floor, remembering the woman who had once stood alone on that terrace, believing her future had ended. That woman had been wrong, Elena thought, smiling quietly against Daniel's shoulder. Her future had not ended that night. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for her to walk far enough away from what she thought she wanted to finally recognize what she actually needed instead. The song ended, and Daniel pulled back slightly, looking down at her with an expression of such open, uncomplicated love that Elena felt, for a moment, entirely overwhelmed by the simple, quiet magnitude of how far she had traveled to arrive here, in this exact room, on her own terms, at last. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Daniel asked, offering her his arm as the orchestra shifted into another song around them. "I have never been more ready for anything in my life," Elena said, and took his arm, stepping forward together into the glittering light of the room and into whatever future they had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build side by side.